This is always the most nerve-wracking part of starting a webinar. It's like kicking off the live and getting ready to go.
And me, my role, Shannon.
I know you're like first up. This is always the most nerve-wracking part of starting a
My,
webinar. It's
We're
like
my
live,
heart.
kicking off the live and getting ready to go.
guys. We're live.
Me, my
My
role,
heart.
Shannon.
I know you're like first up. This is always the most nerve-wracking part of starting a
We're
webinar.
starting the
It's like
My
webinar.
heart.
kicking off the live and getting ready to go.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Mommy, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the Afrobarometer Voices Africa webinar on women's rights, equality, and empowerment. My name is Mami Ekuya Amwachum. I'm Afrobarometer's communications coordinator for North and Anglophone West Africa, and I'm based at CDD Ghana. I'm very happy to be your moderator for today's discussion, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. This webinar, by way of introduction, is hosted by Afrobarometer in partnership with Oxfam in Africa and the International Development Research Center, IDRC. And this webinar also aligns with the UN's 2025 International Women's Day theme for all women and girls, rights, equality, and empowerment. And this is one of the themes that really resonates with me. And I'm sure it resonates with a lot of you as well. So what are we going to be discussing today? Today, we're going to be examining the factors that are slowing gender equality progress and the factors that point out to the key human rights challenges facing women and the rise of anti-rights movements threatening sexual and reproductive health rights in Africa, on the continent, and even globally. And to help us unpack these topics, I am very excited to be joined by amazing women who are making an impact in the various fields that they find themselves in. And to start off with my introduction, I'm very happy to introduce to you Amina Oyabola. She is a board member at Afrobarometer, and I'll be telling you a bit more about her shortly. I also have my colleague and friend, Shannon Van Wakosa. She is a digital portfolio manager at Afrobarometer. And I'm happy to introduce my new friends, Felicita Gitonga Felicita is the Gender Justice Lead with Oxfam in Africa. We also have Martha Mutisi. She is the Senior Program Specialist in Democratic and Inclusive Governance with IDRC. And last but not the least is the amazing Dinah Demba Mutondo. Dinah is the Country Coordinator for African Peer Review Mechanism. Hello, ladies, and how are you feeling today?
Very well,
So
thank you.
excited.
Feeling
Very
great.
excited.
Great.
Thank
I'm
you.
so happy to have you join us. Thank you all so much. So just before we go into it, let me just lay down some few house rules. Please note that our session today is being recorded and it's also being streamed live on YouTube. We've put the link, the YouTube link in the chat session. So please copy it and share it widely with your friends. And for those of you who prefer the French language and for our Francophone friends, please know that we have the interpretation. So please click on the globe icon and then select French and you'll be able to hear everything we discussed today in the French language. We'd also want to encourage our dear participants to use the Q&A feature to type in all your burning questions, and I'll be more than happy to read them when we get to the Q&A session. We, for those of us who want to tweet, and I encourage all of you to do so, the hashtag for our conversation today is for all women and girls. We also have International Women's Day 2025, IWD 2025. We also have Accelerate Action, Gender Equality, and Voices Africa. And if you're tweeting, please tag us across all social media platforms, tag at Afrobarometer, tag at Oxfam in Africa, at IDRC_CRDI and APRM org, but don't worry, we'll put this in the chat so that you can see. And so, ladies and gentlemen, to officially open this webinar, we're now going to hear the welcome remarks from Afrobarometer's board member, Madam Amina Oyabola, and she is an amazing one. I've had the pleasure of meeting her personally, and just a bit about her. She has over 35 years of experience spanning legal practice, corporate leadership, and women's empowerment. And she's a powerhouse advocate for gender equality and inclusive leadership. She's also the founder of WISCAR, and she's a member of Nigeria's Presidential Council on Support to Women and Girls. So when I say she's everything women's empowerment, now you understand. And she's also dedicated to mentoring and empowering women across industries. Amina, thank you so much for joining us. Such a pleasure to have you here today. And we're ready to hear from you. So please take over.
Thank you so much, Mami, for that wonderful introduction. And, good morning to all the distinguished panelists, on this platform. It is indeed an honor to welcome you all to this very important webinar on gender equality and women's rights. This year's International Women's Day theme, for all women and girls, rights, equality, empowerment, is both a rallying cry and a challenge. It calls on us to take bold and immediate action to close the gender gap, a cause that resonates deeply with me, both personally and professionally. Throughout my career, I have witnessed the persistent challenges that women face, barriers to leadership, economic exclusion, and deeply entrenched biases. These obstacles are not new, but the urgency to dismantle them has never been greater. That is why this discussion today is so timely. It is a reminder that progress requires not just policies, but action, commitment, and accountability. This year also marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a landmark commitment adopted by 193 nations to advance women's rights and achieve gender equality. Despite some progress over the past 3 decades, no country has fully achieved gender equality, and significant gaps and obstacles remain. In Africa, more specifically, women's political representation and leadership have seen both advancements and ongoing challenges. Let's start with parliamentary representation. As of 2024, women occupy approximately 26% of parliamentary seats across Africa, a slight increase from 25% in 2021. This progress is uneven, with countries like Rwanda leading globally, where women hold 64% of seats in its lower house, while other countries lag very far behind. Let's talk a little bit about leadership positions. The African continent has witnessed a decline in female heads of state over the past decade, with only 2 women currently serving as national leaders. However, milestones like Namibia electing its first female president, Netumbo Ndadi Ndiatwa, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, in recent months signal positive change. In terms of economic participation, women are disproportionately employed in informal, unstable jobs with limited access to education and training. They perform 4 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men, exceeding the global average. Despite compromising over half of Africa's agricultural workforce, women own a dismal only 12% of agricultural land. In terms of education, while strides have been made, 23% of girls in sub-Saharan Africa still do not receive a primary education. Factors such as early marriage and cultural norms continue to hinder girls' educational attainment. Now, these statistics are more than just numbers. They represent the lived experiences of millions of women and girls across our continent. Excuse me. As a board member of Afrobarometer, I am proud to be part of an organization that does more than just study these disparities. Afrobarometer actively works to address them. Unlike many institutions where women remain underrepresented by the decision-making table, Afrobarometer has taken deliberate steps to lead by example. And today, women outnumber men on our board, ensuring that leadership decisions reflect diverse perspectives. In our fieldwork, we encourage our national partners to recruit more female enumerators and enforce a 50-50 gender alteration of respondents, ensuring that women's voices are not just heard, but counted. We also incorporate special gender modules in our surveys, generating crucial data that sheds light on the lived realities of women and girls across Africa. This research is more than numbers. It is a tool for advocacy, a catalyst for change, and a foundation for stronger policies that can transform lives. Beyond research, Afrobarometer is deeply committed to empowering women through capacity building, through mentorship and leadership development. We are creating opportunities at every level to ensure that gender inclusion is not an afterthought, but a core principle embedded in everything we do. This commitment aligns perfectly with the spirit of International Women's Day. The truth is, when women lead, societies thrive. When women have equal access to opportunities, economies grow. When women's voices are amplified, democracy is strengthened. Yet, despite progress, the data remains clear, and you can't argue with data. Across Africa, women and girls continue to face systemic disadvantages. They are underrepresented in politics, locked out of economic opportunities, and disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. Afrobarometer's research consistently highlights these realities, but data alone is not enough. We must translate these insights into action. We must push for stronger policies that empower women in leadership, in business, and in governance. We must advocate for labor laws that recognize the challenges of informal workers, for financial systems that grant women equal access to credit, and for education systems that instill gender equity from an early age. This is not just a women's issue. It is a national development issue. Africa will never reach its full potential if half of its population is left behind. As I round up, and as we discuss these crucial issues at this webinar, I invite each of us to renew our commitment to championing gender inclusion, advocating for policies that create real opportunities, and working collectively, government, businesses, and civil society, to break the barriers that hold women back. The time for accelerated action is now. I thank you once again for giving me this opportunity and for being here. And I look forward to the insightful and very impactful conversations that we're going to listen to from our erudite panelists. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Well, Amina, thank you so much for that wonderful remarks. And just listening to you, I was just hit with mixed feelings. I mean, at one part, you were showing us the progress that's been made, but then the data, the high level stats also show that there's so much disparities. For instance, when you mentioned that women only own 12% of agricultural land, or the fact that 23% of girls in sub-Saharan Africa still do not receive primary education. I was just asking myself, are we even close to achieving gender parity? So thank you for this information. I think it sets the tone perfectly for the rest of our conversation. So that was a wonderful remark. Thank you, Amina. And I think we'll just go straight into it to take our first presentation, which will also be Afrobarometer's latest findings on gender equality trends in Africa. And this presentation, I think following on Amina's remarks, is going to highlight key disparities in education, in leadership, in employment, and reproductive rights. And I'm very happy to invite my colleague Shannon to give us that presentation. But just a brief introduction about Shannon. Shannon is a digital comm strategist with
Hi, Mami. Thank you so much. I lost you a little bit. I think, I don't know, there was a connection issue on my side. But thank you so much for having me. I'm going to get straight into it. So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about Afrobarometer, if we've got some people who haven't interacted with us on this webinar. So we are a Pan-African, non-partisan survey research network, and we provide reliable data on African experiences and evaluations of democracy, governance, and quality of life. Our data is a public good, and it's freely available on our website in multiple formats. Our goal is to give African people a voice in policy and decision making. Since 1999, we've conducted 9 survey rounds in 42 countries, and we're actually at the tail end of our 10th round of surveys at the moment, and that should run until the middle of 2025, and then we're back at it planning for round 11. So if you look at where we've worked, you can see it's the majority of the continent. The only places that we haven't worked or we haven't surveyed yet are the areas that are indicated in gray. And then that kind of code on the side indicates where we started surveys and then have continued them. So you can see red indicates where we first started our surveys. So a lot of people have questions about our methodology. A quick overview is that we use a nationally representative sample of citizens aged 18 and above, so adult citizens. And our sample sizes are between 1,200 and 2,400 respondents, and that yields a margin of error of approximately 2 and 3%. We conduct face-to-face interviews in the language of the respondent's choice, and we use a standard questionnaire that allows us comparisons across countries and over time. And you can do this yourself on our website. We have an online data analysis tool where you can conduct that your own analysis across time and across countries. So I'm going to ask that we skip straight to the slide that starts off with our key findings. And I want to unpack some data that we have surrounding education and economic empowerment. So when we look at educational attainment, we can see on average across 28 African countries surveyed in 2024 and 2025, women are less likely than men, and I think we're just having a bit of a technical issue with the PowerPoint, but I'm going to keep going and it'll catch up with us. Women are less likely than men to have a secondary or post-secondary education. So we're looking at 53% versus 62%. A gap that is even wider among younger citizens, although the levels of educational attainment are also higher. So we know that the youth in Africa are the most educated, but we can see that women are still less likely to have secondary or post-secondary education. While Afrobarometer records significant gains over the past decade in educational achievement for both men and women, the gender gap has been relatively constant. Apologies for our technical issues. So we're going to be looking at the next slide after that one, which is around women having an equal chance in being elected. So next slide, please. Perfect. A sizable and slowly growing majority, so that's 74% of citizens, say women should have the same chance of being elected to public office as men. These views are most common among urban residents, women, educated citizens, and the economically well-off. Amina briefly touched on asset ownership, but we see that women trail men significantly in ownership of key productive and informational assets, such as computers, mobile phones, motor vehicles, radios, bank accounts, and mobile money accounts. If you just look at that key over there, we can see women in yellow and men in orange, and we can see there's a significant trailing of women. So when we get down to who decides how money is used, women are less likely than men to say that they make household financial decisions for themselves. That's 35% versus 42%. And then employment status, we briefly touched on that as well. Men are far more likely than women to be employed. So when we look at barriers to women's employment, we see that employers preferring to hire men cite a lack of necessary education or skills among women, childcare, and lack of remote or flexible work arrangements as the main barriers to women's employment. We're going to move on to sexual and reproductive health rights, which is our next section of data. So about 2 in 10 respondents say that women and girls in their community often terminate pregnancies, and another 20% say they do so occasionally. Fewer than half, so that's 45%, say pregnancies are rarely or never terminated in their community. We move on then to justification for pregnancy termination, and we see that about 7 in 10 respondents say abortion is never justified in cases where the pregnancy is unwanted or where the mother is economically unable to care for the child. But respondents are divided on whether abortion is justified if the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest. A majority think it's justified if a mother's health or her life is at risk. That's a nice segue into women's bodily autonomy. So majorities endorse women's autonomy in making marriage and reproductive decisions. When we look at access to contraceptives, we see that about 6 in 10 citizens say contraceptives should be made available for anyone who is sexually active, regardless of marital status. And then about half say it should be available irrespective of age. I'm going to let the slides catch up so we can just have a look at that. Now, onto sex education being taught in schools. 3/4 of respondents endorse the teaching of sex education in schools. To end off this section of data, when we look at pregnant girls and mothers being allowed to continue school, we see that 8 in 10 say girls should be allowed to continue their schooling, even if they become pregnant or have children. We're going to move on to data surrounding gender-based violence and discrimination. So when we asked in 2021 to 2023, so our round 9 surveys about the most important women's rights issues, we saw that Africans see gender-based violence as the most important women's rights issue that their government and society need to address. This was followed by too few women in influential positions in government, as Amina touched on, and unequal access to education and unequal opportunities in the workplace. So if we zoom in onto that most important problem and we look at the frequency of gender-based violence, we see that almost 4 in 10 citizens say GBV is somewhat common or very common in their community. And then across 28 countries surveyed in 2024 and 2025, about 1/4 of citizens say girl students often or always face discrimination, harassment, or requests for sexual favors from their teachers. Just shocking. And then when we look into whether people believe women and girls when they complain about discrimination or harassment, 1/3 say it's not likely that people will believe women and girls if they complain about being discriminated against or harassed in schools, workplaces, or other public spaces. And then about 8 in 10 respondents say police need to do somewhat more or much more to protect girls and women from discrimination and harassment in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. And that brings an end to our data presentation. Yeah, so much to discuss here and to unpack. Ready to get into it, so I'm going to hand it back to Mame.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Findings and quite a couple of jumped at, for instance, the barriers to women's employment, where we had respondents saying that that employers prefer to hire men to women. That's quite disturbing. And how women also lack the necessary education and skills in employment. And then the fact that gender-based violence continues to be an issue and the most important women's rights issue. I think it sets the tone again for further discussion, because these are very important. And then and reproductive health and rights. And Felista is on standby to share these findings with us. But just a bit about her. She's also a passionate African feminist. She's a gender justice expert and an activist, and she has over 10 years experience in social justice, advocacy, and policy analysis. She's also been at the forefront of women's rights advocacy, championing sexual health, and also championing the fight against gender-based. So welcome once again, and we're ready to hear from you.
Hello, are you able to hear me? Very good. Thank you so much, Mame, for that introduction. So before I do my presentation is to say, for those who might not know Oxfam International, this is a movement that works across the globe, and we are a confederation, and we work in more than 80 countries across the globe, largely addressing inequality, poverty, and discrimination. And of course, we work with different movements across the globe to be able to achieve this. Now, on my presentation, Oxfam has done a global report as part of the 30 years of Beijing plan of action, and largely also not this just being a report, but also a campaign as part of this engagement, and the new campaign being personal to powerful, which really reflects on the last 30 years of Beijing platform of action. And of course, acknowledging that there has been quite a bit of progress seen across different parts of the world, including Africa. However, we are very cognizant of the fact that we are experiencing a pushback. We are also experiencing challenges in terms of resourcing, and also we are seeing a rollback in terms of the various women's rights issues across the globe. Next slide. Next. Yeah, so in terms of looking at the report and the campaign itself is really for us to look at how is it that we can protect the gains that have been made under gender justice in the face of the current anti-rights, anti-gender movements that is growing across the world. I mean, from the inauguration of Donald Trump, one of the things he did is sign one of those declarations to say that this is the description of gender. We have seen the defunding of a lot of essential women human rights programs. And also this wave is not just happening in the USA. We have seen it happen in African countries where we are seeing a change in language, removal of ministries of gender from government operations, or renaming them and removing the word women's rights, as in the case of Senegal, and also rebranding it as the Ministry of Family, largely, of course, this being informed by this kind of anti-rights and anti-gender rhetoric. Yeah, next slide. So in terms of the last 30 years, yes, we acknowledge that governments have made commitments to gender justice through the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action. We have seen some progress in terms of the number of countries that have laws that protect women from different forms of violence. We have laws that have tried to push for more women in the workforce. We are having also global conversations that seek to address the high burden of care work among women. We are also seeing pockets of engagement to try and advance access to sexual and reproductive health rights. However, at the same time, we see that the most vulnerable are facing increasing threats with, of course, harsher policies restricting bodily autonomy and fundamental freedoms. So for example, in the case of Kenya and the Gambia, where there are laws protecting women from FGM, there has been a pushback to, reverse those laws in the name of culture and in the name of religion, which of course we have seen women's rights organizations and feminist movement fight back to this and be able to win in these contexts. Yeah. Next slide. I think we can go to the next slide. So in terms of really what is not working is that, one, the whole structure of the global economy is not built to work for women. It's largely built to benefit men while leaving women and LGBTQI people behind. And this, looking at it from a place of the fact that the anti-rights movement and all these kind of engagements are largely funded by white men who are either billionaires of affluence or high economic standing within the countries they live in. They are either in political positions and ability to be able to influence this engagement. And as you can see in the statistics, and I think some of this have been alluded to in the presentation by Shannon, is that really we have situations where women can be fired while pregnant, but also at the same time work in very precarious situations in the workplace where they are not afforded decent pay or decent social protection, including access to maternity cover and all that. And also in terms of looking at the SDGs, we have I think now just 5 years to the 2030 review process, and still very few markers have been made around this. And even as we are witnessing the global movement of far-right movement, we are seeing governments refusing to stand and back the promises they have made through legal and policy framework around issues of gender justice. We have also seen a huge decline in aid that comes to women's rights issues. And we anticipate, even with the current environment of USAID, and even changing of focus within the European space, that we will see a more decline in terms of funding for women's rights and all these groups. But even as we talk about these shrinking resources that would change the lives of women, girls, and people of different gender identities across the world, we are seeing the growth in wealth of these men who are largely billionaires, who are also funding this kind of rhetoric. And I think currently the situation that is happening in America between Trump and Elon Musk really aptly describes this kind of relationship and all that sort of thing. But also to understand that even as resources are shrinking for women's rights organizations and feminist movement, there is also increasing well-organized funding for conservative groups that of course have emerged and are attacking issues of women's rights. They are co-opting the language of women's rights organizations and proceeding to call it still a fight for women's rights, but of course saying women shouldn't be able to access abortion and frame that as an issue of protection of women's health and rights. So this, of course, being a huge framing across African countries, where we are seeing, of course, the conversations around issues of reproductive health rights being fueled by Christian fundamentalism, but also either denying of colonialism, but also at the same time relying on colonial arguments around access to women's rights and the standing of women within the society. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, so then what can we do in terms of this as we face this kind of situation? I think one, is for us to rebuild the social contract, fund gender justice, protect our rights, and defend bodily autonomy. But also, how will this be done? I think once we, as we are seeing, a lot of these spaces, governments have failed us, but we are seeing a lot of movements rise and stand and fight back. And I think some of those include even what we saw in Kenya last year, with young people standing and fighting for economic justice and pushing a government to make change. We have also seen movement in South Africa, in Nigeria, in the Gambia, where, you know, women have stood up against violence against women, against femicide, and all kinds of violation. So rebuilding of social contract might not happen through government, it might happen through citizens being able to push back to the rollback of rights in this situation. I think the valuing and distribution of care work is also very key, because here we have an economy that is really fueled by the labor that women offer. Women subsidize the economy, although this work goes unnoticed and undervalued. And also at the same time, who benefits from this failure to recognize care work, failure to recognize women's contribution? It is the capitalist initiative that, of course, is largely led by white male billionaires across the world, who actually, they do not care about preservation, they care about extraction and profiteering, and through that, they do not even care for people or even the planet. So valuing care is a really big part of it, but also taxing the rich. And I think this conversation have become even more present in the current ecosystem we have been in since the start of 2025. And really seeing what people who have extreme wealth can be able to do in terms of rollback of rights, not just for women, but for everybody. Ability for the rich to be able to buy their way in government, to fund movements that are far right, colonial, and also very much anti-gender, is a very present thing happening across the globe. And so it's very important for us to continue to have this conversation about taxing the rich and having these resources distributed in terms of social welfare, of engaging different citizens and the needs that they need. I think also to strengthen the movements, because literally it's the movements that have been able to stand up and fight for these rights. So I'll end my presentation here. I know there are 2 more slides, but they're very much similar to some of the comments that I have made. I'll stop right here. Thanks, Mame.
Thank you so much, Felista, for sharing those findings with us. Very, very interesting. If you ask me, what I found disturbing in your report is one of the findings that said 1 in 3 million women can be fired whilst they are pregnant. It really got me sad. And I also like the call to action where you're asking us, what can we do going forward? And that hashtag, I think, is personal to powerful. I think that's one thing that, if we don't hear anything at all from this webinar, we should be able to work our way with that it starts with us. Thank you so much. And so I think we'll just go straight into the panel discussion. We've had some interesting findings shared by both Felista and Shannon, and I'm sure that these findings also, you found some very, very interesting. So I'll just quickly go around the panel. Shannon, Martha, Felista, and Diana, just to give me your impressions on some of the findings that we've shared. So Diana, if you're with us, or maybe let's start with Martha. Martha, is there anything you found interesting so far when Shannon and Felista shared their presentation?
Yes, thank you so much, Mame, and thank you for the presentations, Shannon and Felista. I think what really I found fascinating from the results that were shared by the two colleagues, from Felicitas' presentation, the notion that we need to go back to the basics, which is ensure that we strengthen social movements, because it's in the power of collectivity, power of solidarity, that we can actually get through these difficult or seemingly restrictive spaces that we are facing. I think it might appear daunting, but Felisa really touched on a very important issue, that when we look historically, the women's movement, we were able to record significant advances and transformation in the women's movement because of the power of networks of solidarity, networks of collaboration. So we go by the adage that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And for us, really going back to the basics of the history of social movement is very important, to understand that we can only be able to challenge, these global systemic inequalities when we stand together, when we band together across, movements, whether it's women's movements, partnering with LGBTQI movements as well, and other movements that demand their right. The second thing that I also found fascinating is that we seem to be going back to an extractive mode of global economy. And for me, I think that also is a quick reminder that we really need to continue to challenge unjust, patriarchal, capitalist practices, which really rely on extraction, which rely on pitting different movements against each other. So for me, those were the two critical issues: the importance of solidarity and the importance of really challenging unequal structural arrangement, particularly within the global economy. And maybe lastly, I also think that we stand to benefit if we remember that the personal is political. At the end of the day, I think all these issues, when it comes to the basics, it really comes to impacting on women's bodily autonomy, women's access to reproductive health. So we need to challenge political systems that, at the end of the day, have an impact on personal issues, like your right to access to sexual and reproductive health, for example. Those are political issues. So we need to challenge political systems as a first starting point. Over to you, Mami.
Indeed, Martha, we do need to challenge political systems that remain barriers to, women and gender equality. Shannon, do you want to share something small from both your presentation and Felicitas' own?
Definitely. I think, like Martha's touched on this, but particularly in Felicitas' presentation, I think the most jarring thing that I saw was that the combined funding of 3 anti-LGBTQIA plus organizations outnumbered that of 8,000. And I just always want to impress upon all of us how the struggles of marginalized people on the margins of vulnerable populations are intrinsically linked, and that the women's right movement is intrinsically linked with that of the LGBTQI plus movement as well. So that was jarring for me to see. And yeah, I think it's I'll talk about it a little bit later, but I think it's so important for us also, as people who identify as women, to understand that whatever oppression is taking place to people who identify as LGBTQIA plus, that directly impacts us. And then I think obviously Felicita also spoke about unemployment and the unpaid work that women do. And then we look at the Afrobarometer data, and we look at formal employment for women, and how it's a continuation of normative colonial patriarchal systems. And it's these are the things that are crushing us. So I'm very excited to get into the actual panel discussion, because we must unpack all of these things.
Absolutely. Felicita, Even though you shared your presentation, did anything jump at you? Anything you'd want to share, even from Shannon's presentation or from your perspective?
Yeah, I think for me is also being able to see the statistics that Shannon has been able to show us, and also trying to see that in relation to the report done by Oxfam, and really seeing a lot of similarities, especially in terms of
Right.
decline of women's in decision-making processes, but also acknowledging that even sometimes the women who are in decision-making processes are part of the patriarchal structure and are not there really to advance the rights of other women and other marginalized groups, but largely to serve as part of that. And I think also speaking to the importance of even now, which is more critical than ever, is for us to push back with numbers, push back with data, push back with statistics. Because the other movement, which is the anti-rights, anti-gender movement, has really capitalized on disinformation and misinformation and actually coached our own language and used it in spaces where they can even engage governments and push for very negative, harmful policies that affects women and other marginalized groups. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Felista. Dinah, can you hear me? If you caught on with some of the presentations, what were some of the things that you found very interesting?
Yes, thank you so much for giving me the floor. First of all, I just want to congratulate both Shannon and Felista for the presentations. And I think what stood out for me is that, okay, number one, when we look at the statistics, and I'm always very grateful to like get to interact with the latest statistics and so on, because from a policy perspective it really helps to show from a policy making perspective, it really helps to show where are the gaps. And from having a picture, an overall picture that was much darker than some of the statistics show, for me, when Shannon was actually talking about who decides the decision in a household, I had a much darker picture about, the decision making of or the influence or the power of a woman when it comes to decision making in the households. So I think I'm very grateful for that, because it shows that despite having areas where there's been decline, there's some areas that show some kind of progress and some hope. And I think it will be nice to see how to address the areas that are still lacking, and maybe focus resources in those areas. But also what I would like to say is that we've done a lot of policies. When it comes to the normative framework for women's rights and gender equality, there's so many that has been done at the policy level. However, there seems to be a gap. I don't know, for some reason it's not really translating into action. We speak of decline in terms of women representation and so on. So it will be nice to see how those can be actually addressed on the ground, because adding more policies is great. However, it's like, where is that missing link? So that was my own personal reflection, that it's something that we always witness, but then having the numbers confirming that is also a good indication that maybe strategies have to be relooked at. Approach, we need more sensitization. I don't know, but I guess we'll have maybe space and time to discuss that a bit more. Thank you very much.
Dana, you're definitely right. I mean, we do have the policies, but then clearly with all that we've discussed so far, you can tell that they are not translating into actions. And that's definitely one thing we need to look at. But ladies and gentlemen, just to give you a brief introduction about Martha, she's spoken already. But Martha is a wonderful, hardworking lady who has extensive experience working across government, regional organizations, and civil society. She also leads research on access to justice accountability, and the empowerment of women and youth. And you could clearly tell that in her submission. And we just heard from Dinah. Dinah too also works as a country coordinator for the African Peer Review Mechanism. Her role there includes building capacity in member states for the promotion of good governance and tracking the implementation of governance practices in AU member states, amongst other activities. She's also responsible for the development and implementation of the gender program, as well as the establishment of a communications network to increase the participation of women and media professionals in APRM. So it's really good to have you ladies again. But Felicita, I think I'd like to come back to you with a more direct question. And the thing is that we know many African governments are rolling back reproductive rights due to pressure from conservative and anti-rights groups. But the question is, what are the real consequences of these policies on women's lives and futures? And I think another thing we want to look at is, how do we depoliticize women's health and make access to reproductive care a fundamental right more than a moral debate?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mame Akua. I think one of the things, I think the immediate danger is the rollback of rights that women have been enjoying, and even the progress in terms of developing of either policies or even funding that goes towards supporting women's rights, but also to look at it in a very human perspective. If governments refuse to take action in terms of implementation of laws against gender-based violence, then we have a rise of GBV, intimate partner violence, but also femicides. So the expense, the actual consequence of us failing to address this is women being able to lose their lives through this violation of rights. I think also if government is not implementing or also spending in terms of reproductive health rights, we have women having to access abortion in unsafe situations. And then also this, in the end, really has direct impact on the lives of women in terms of either death or even long-term permanent health complications. So literally, this is not just a child play conversation. This is something that will have real consequences on the lives of women and girls and people of different identities across the region as well. But also at the same time, I think it is important to understand that when it comes to resourcing social justice, anytime governments are put in a situation where they have to cut budgets, they usually cut what goes to gender. Yeah. So even the current model of what our government, especially in Africa, are going through in terms of debt, in terms of austerity, there is real danger in having reduced funding even at government level for various, issues and rights around the needs of women. It could be even access to family planning. I mean, the USAID pulling out funding has made a lot of countries panic in terms of provision of serious healthcare needs like prevention and even treatment of HIV and AIDS, access to family planning, universal health access for not just children but also for women and girls across the continent. So really, in the end of it, there's really real consequence in the life of women and girls around this. But then in terms of how do we really push back, it's to understand the conversation, even though it's being framed as a moral conversation, it's actually more of a political conversation. And political conversation in the essence of who is having this conversation. And I think I have alluded to that in my presentation, where this framing of this world of where, you know, we don't talk about gender anymore, we want to roll back on rights, is actually informed by a white, male, wealthy operation that is actually global. And we are able to see this and understand this, and also in terms of the funding, because we are seeing these same individuals or institutions that are aligned to these people. They are the same ones going around funding the organizations that actually are spreading or are engaging different actors in our governments around these issues. One of the key studies or maybe information that has come to the fore is that if you look at a lot of the MPs who have put out laws either against LGBTQI communities, they have put out laws around access to safe abortion, or government not being able to allow that, or roll back in terms of completely the law should not even allow abortion in the context of health or even rape. If you look at the laws that are pushing back on this idea of family through the member of parliaments, largely those member of parliaments are getting a lot of resourcing from these pro-family institutions in the north. They are also getting a lot of like coaching and support in terms of drafting these very backward policies that really attack the rights of different groups of people. And this is not just in gender. It's also something we are seeing in issues such as climate. We are seeing this in issues such as agriculture. It's really a movement pushing to take the world back to default settings where really the person on the top who is male and white is the only person benefiting from the labor and extraction of everyone else who exists in this model. So being able to understand really this conversation is not a moral one, it's a political one. And also who are the actors is the way we are going to be able to push back in that context. Thank you, Mame.
Yes, Felicita, well said. Just checking our time to make sure that we don't go beyond the scheduled time. But Martha, coming to you, my question is, in many African households, women generate income, which is a good thing, right? But the problem is that they lack financial decision-making power. So I think the conversation is, how do we move beyond economic participation through financial autonomy for women?
Thanks, Mame. Yeah, so I think that there are multiple ways through which we can move beyond mere economic participation to really promote wholesome financial autonomy for women. And for me, I think the starting point, and of course, this is kind of influenced by my background, but I think the starting point is really to recognize that human rights are at the core of the women's economic empowerment agenda. So not unless we start by addressing harmful, discriminatory social norms and practices, as well as unequal laws, I think we won't go far in addressing the economic exclusion, because at the root of economic exclusion is the deeply embedded values that are in society. So we need to start by challenging those values, challenging social norms that really perpetuate gender inequality. Looking at the laws, we need to also undertake legal reform and legal review, scrapping off unjust laws that perpetuate women's economic exclusion. That involves us looking at property laws, land laws, marriage laws, access to finance laws, But also we need to look at women's economic empowerment from an ecosystem perspective that requires us strengthening women's participation across all sectors of society, whether it's in the social sector, in the economic sector, in academia, in civil society, in politics and public service. We need women to be represented in those sectors, because some of the decisions regarding property rights or access to finance are made in the political sphere. So we need to have women in our corner there. But we also need to have women in financial institutions so that they can influence, the gendering of financial systems and institutions. We also need to address the supply side of women's economic empowerment. That requires us really looking at, girls' enrollment in education, for example, having more girls enrolling and completing their education, looking at some of the bottlenecks and blockages for girls completing their education. But lastly, I would also say we need to really promote and establish accountability mechanisms to protect women right to economic empowerment and economic support. We need those mechanisms to be fully functioning, to be working, and also really to respond to some of the advocacies that is taking place when women are calling for the financial systems to be revisited. We need women in those spaces as well. We need some sort of degree of accountability in those institutions. Over to you, Mami.
Awesome. Thank you, Martha. I think one of the things you said that I find really interesting is your points on how we need to look at the legal review of these laws that exist that actually prevents women from taking or having access to the things that actually belong to them or they should have access to. I think it's very profound for me. Thank you. And Shannon, I'm coming to you now. You showed us through the AB data that women are far more likely than men to be unemployed. And we're also seeing slow progress in literacy among women. And I think it was also stated in Amina's welcome remark as well. And we also see how there's gender gap when it comes to education. So there's also rising digital education tools, right? So I guess the question is, how can technology bridge the gender gap in education? And beyond that, how can we use technology to bridge that gap in remote or marginalized areas?
Thanks, Mame. So I think when you look at the use of digital tools in education and kind of the barriers that they address, it's fall under these two broad umbrellas. And the first is creating flexible and safe learning environments. So being able to bring those tools into a home or a safe space for women or girls or people who are non-binary. And then, ensuring that there's that constant stream of education and that access to that. And then there's increased access to resources. There's a world of education online, even if just like on YouTube courses and things like that. But, and this might not be where you want to take the conversation. My caveat around digital technology is always that like the digitization of our world is very it exists within this paradox of, yes, it can address inequality, but it can also worsen inequality. So when I talk about the role of digital tools in Africa, particularly, we always have to bring up the digital divide. It's so important because even though some gains have been made on the continent, we still have a very big digital divide. And this is particularly around access to devices and then electricity. So that actual tool that you're using to access the web is not there. And then the infrastructure doesn't exist also for you to be on the internet. So across the continent, only 18% of respondents personally own a computer, and a further 15% have access to a laptop in their household, while half personally own a smartphone. So 47% of respondents own a smartphone. And we see, Africa is a smartphone heavy, continent. But there are barriers to participating online with a smartphone. It's not going to be the same type of interaction as having a desktop or a laptop. And that's where we see, the ownership isn't really there. And then even when we like zoom in on who owns these devices to access the internet, it's men, it's urbanites, it's the young, well-educated and wealthy people. So there, again, you know, bringing in your question about how do we access people in remote and marginalized areas, they don't have access right now. And then you need electricity to get to it. And over the past decade, only 23% of households have had reliable access to electricity from the grid. So yes, so many incredible digital innovations. They're largely still benefiting people who have upward mobility, who are men. You know, if we look at the divide in the world, it's people in the global north. There's so much work to be done, yes, policy-wise, but you know, as Diana's so rightly brought up, we can have the policy, but then we need the implementation as well. And that's also about like people coming together, and it's not just like a government policy. There's a role that private sector needs to play there because they have ownership of that infrastructure for people to access, you know, the digital space. So that's always my kind of warning. Yes, it can be incredible technology, but it's not a silver bullet because it can also worsen inequality. And if we don't address the lack of access in terms of infrastructure to access to devices, access to internet, then it's going to put the most vulnerable Africans in a worse position if we continue to kind of, you know, for it to be as widespread as it is now. So maybe not the answer you were looking for. It's got its plus sides, but we need to do that groundwork of ensuring that everyone has access to it.
Well said, Shannon. I mean, your response just got me asking a lot of questions. So one front, even as the issue of electricity actually contributes to the digital divide, and I think that's very telling, right? And then even for people who have electricity, then there's also the access to internet. So internet penetration and then infrastructure. How many people have laptops at home? Wow, I think we have more
Completely. Who has
questions than
access to
answers.
data? Who has access to
Right.
data? You know, how much does data cost? All of those things are barriers.
Yeah, definitely a conversation we need to continue having. But coming to you, Diana, thank you, Shannon. We know that quotas, I mean, I think we've had a fair share of quotas on the continent and globally, and they've helped increase women's representation. But I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, are they enough to guarantee real power and influence? And also, how do we change that political pipeline so that young women are not just encouraged to participate, but importantly, they're also equipped to lead? I'd love to hear your points on this, Diana.
Thank you so much, Mami. That's one of my favorite questions because it's true that okay, let me start from the work we do even with APRM, is that we have instruments that we implement into countries to conduct assessments and so on. And one of the questions we have in our questionnaire is, oh yeah, okay, is there any legislation or, you know, legal provision to push or promote women participation? And the first thing that we all think of is quotas and so on. But we've also seen that quotas are not as efficient. Quotas alone are not enough. You know, there's perception that, okay, we have women sitting at the table. Okay, then what? Are they actually capable of addressing certain issues? And in all of that, there are some issues that have to be addressed, you know, like we're looking at like whether it's structural or cultural barriers, you know, when it comes to having women sitting and filling up quotas, you know. When we talk about structural barriers, it's like lack of resources, you know. Do the women that sit at the table have the necessary resources, capacity to actually lead and also make sure that their voices are counted and heard amongst their male peers, you know? In which capacity are they really representing women at those level of leadership? And in terms of cultural barriers as well, we look at how can women lead, you know. Some some of the people we interact with when you contact focus group, they say like, listen, in my country we have peace and security issues. Would a woman really be able to address, those, how as they call it, like hard topic, is a woman equipped, women are more equipped to deal with issues of education, social issues and so on. So there is a bit of that gap, that is clearly reflected in people's perception. And when you ask about, so all those perceptions basically also speak of the fact that, quota alone are not enough, because there is the issue of capacity, of skills of those women and so on, that sometimes gets, questions and challenged. And to address that, when you talk about the political pipeline, when it comes to, young women and how we can possibly change that, I think one thing that can be highlighted is, okay, it will start with political will, the will to change. We have to look also at education, when it comes to early development and mentorship for boys and girls, understanding that, when we talk about leadership development, we try to impart women encourage women to be more empowered, learn, and so that when they sit at the table, their capacity, their skills are not questions. Then also there's the issue of the training within political parties. If you want more women to hold leadership position, political position, women presidents, the thing is that the democracy system are a bit shaped around the political parties and so on. So how do we enforce political parties, how to empower women within political parties to actually take on more responsibilities, So political parties should also institutionalize quotas within their leadership structures and provide capacity building for women candidates, and actually promote women to lead and represent the parties, and so on and so forth. And then there's also the question of, financial support, and also the question of, which is very important, of gender mainstreaming, which is a strategy to promote gender equality, looking at the different layers, of an institution, of processes, looking at, for instance, the APRM. I was running late and I apologize for that, because we were actually in a session where we were looking at talking about issues of sexual harassment and verbal abuse within our continental structure. And I think we have to look at things when we approach those issues, we need to look at, okay, there's the heads, there's the top part, but we also need to look at what are at the foundation. Are the institutions strong enough? Are the institutions promoting gender equality? In which capacity? Are all the employees sensitive about those issues? Then you go up, you look at, okay, are the different directorates, departments also taking into account gender equality, and to which extent, how many heads of the organization or department are actually women, and why are we not seeing more women at our institutional levels, and so on and so forth. So it has to be broken down, and I think it's the same approach when it comes to the political institutions, like political parties. Is like we need to have an approach of where we break things down and see, okay, how do we mainstream gender better in our institutions, so that those quotas can be more significant, and making sure that the women are also more empowered in terms of knowledge. So that's what I would add. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dinah. I think you hit the nail right on the head when you say that quotas are good, but they're not enough. And we need to look at the capacity and skills of these women who we have at the top. And one of the ways we can actually build the capacity of women is through education. And I guess in this sense, is whether through the informal or formal education, both ways should help, right? So thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to encourage our participants to drop in their questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll share it with our speakers if you drop in that question. So please don't be shy. Please drop in your questions. But quickly, Shannon, I think we have some few minutes so I can ask you this question, that gender-based violence, in your presentation, it shows that it remains a major issue in Africa. What are some of the practical steps that governments and communities can take to reduce it?
Thanks, Mame. Yeah, I think I want to focus on communities. So I think that we all need to sit with ourselves and make this like a deeply personal conversation. I think the way that we address GBV is by addressing views that are rooted in patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia. And this is because, all prejudices are interlinked. I think we briefly spoke about that earlier, but, misogyny and homophobia are linked through their shared foundation in patriarchal values and societal norms that enforce rigid gender roles and expectations. And I think like that's a bit of a thing of sitting down and understanding, when we use LGBTQIA identifiers in a pejorative, like gay or lesbian or queer, when we say things like boys don't cry, when there is a boy and a girl in the house and we ask the girl to do the dishes, we are contributing to these views that uphold the system. So I think it's very important for us to sit, especially, as people who identify as women or people who bear children. I think someone might have been Pilesta or Martha spoke about how women uphold patriarchal values as well. And I think it's very important for us to sit with those things and understand like how we perpetuate them, because they seem like small little interactions, but they uphold the system that means that people feel like they are allowed to, come into someone's space and harm them. I think the other thing then is also, for people who identify as men, to sit with those things, to understand, where that comes from, maybe like what insecurities are like taking place within you. And then I think it's not enough to just not be someone who is a perpetrator of GBV. You can't be, you can't create safe spaces for perpetrators as well. You can't just say, I'm not doing it, so I'm not a part of it. There needs to be that conversation of social isolation of people who've been convicted, because we can't normalize this in society. We can't continue to normalize this in society by just saying, that's not my thing. I didn't do it. I'm not going to take part in that. And then I think when you speak about like government, we spoke about the role of policy, but then we need to think about like implementation as well. So enforcement agencies need to be better capacitated with the right type of people who believe victims, people who ensure that we're creating safe spaces for victims of GBV through sensitivity training. And then most importantly, we need to ensure that perpetrators know that they're going to serve time. I think that there's, this is common held belief, or I don't know if it was a piece of data, but the biggest deterrent is not longer sentences. It's the knowledge that you will serve a sentence if you're a perpetrator of GBV. So I think, there's the system. And I think the way that we go about it within our communities and within ourselves is understanding what are the micro interactions that we might be taking part in ourselves that uphold this patriarchal, misogynistic system. And then also understanding that you can't be a victim of one type of marginalization, because they're all intrinsically linked. You can't advocate for one type of, marginalized body if you're not advocating for all marginalized people.
Absolutely. Well said, Shannon. I think it's good that you make us reflect to find out how we ourselves in micro ways contributes to the issue at hand, So that's a good way to put it. But still staying on GBV, gender-based violence, Dinah, I'd like to come back to you on this. We found out last month the AU actually adopted a convention on ending violence against women and girls, and I think that's really awesome. But maybe you can tell us more about this convention and how it aims at protecting victims of gender-based violence. And even though, like we said, we have the policies, how these issues still persist in our in our communities and how we can actually hold, like Shannon just said, hold the perpetrators accountable.
Thank you so much. Yes, so the African Union Convention on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls, yes, was adopted at the very recent historical AU Assembly. It's a big one because this convention is legally binding for member states, and it's it's mandated to provide member states to enact and also enforce laws to protect women and girls from all form of violence. So what it means really is that it can be used to hold like perpetrators accountable through the development of laws and also making sure that not just the legal framework at domestical level, but also the institutional framework is also put in place, meaning looking at, okay, what are the support services also that are lacking or should be established for comprehensive, support of women in terms of medical care, in terms of medical care, psychological support, also looking at, what are the infrastructures or the systems that are put in place for like the assistance of like legal assistance of like survivors. And so it's quite of a comprehensive convention. And also what is very important about this convention is that it also calls for civil society and stakeholders to also have a part of accountability into making sure that the convention is well, there's a level of awareness around it. Like, so when I talk about stakeholders, I'm mentioning the media, and also making sure that, civil societies are all engaged into, the implementation of this convention at national level. So in terms of perpetrator accountability, the convention also emphasized on the importance of strengthening legal processes, ensuring justice also for the survivors, and kind of preventing also offenses, because very often we have a response mechanisms, but we actually don't necessarily have the necessary preventing mechanism, and the convention kind of make provision for that. So I hope that kind of helped. Thank you so much.
It definitely did. I've thoroughly enjoyed your explanation of the convention. I'm very happy about it. But the point Shannon is making that would go beyond the policies, and like even you yourself said, do translate into actions, right? Felisa and Martha, I'll come back to you, but I think we have a question. We have somebody who's ready to ask us a question in the Q&A feature box. Is Kalis? Kalis, can you speak up? Do you have a question for us?
Oui, oui, je prends la parole. On me reçoit?
Oui, monsieur.
Voilà, je tiens d'abord à vous remercier, et toutes les 5, d'avoir documenté la réalité sociale sur laquelle vous êtes appesantis. C'est déjà bien. Maintenant, je ne voudrais quand même attirer notre attention que si nous voulons connaître une amélioration, il faut qu'on travaille sur certaines choses. Et j'en parle et j'ai eu du plaisir à dire qui je suis. Je suis sociologue de la sexualité humaine. Donc, on ne va pas prendre la question qui relève un peu du construit social de la femme et toucher et mélanger ça avec les questions de nouvelles et de l'émergence des questions d'homosexualité sur le continent. Si nous faisons ça, nous avons échoué. Nous avons échoué en ce sens que cette nouvelle émergence de la minorité sexuelle, d'accord, n'est pas encore comprise et acceptée nulle part par ce que j'appelle le construit social du sexe en Afrique. En revanche, les problèmes que nous avons liés à la personne de sexe féminin en termes de représentativité, en termes de présence dans les grandes instances, d'accord, de décision de la vie publique, on peut faire autrement pour pouvoir disposer d'une certaine réduction de ce que j'appelle du périmètre des ténèbres, d'accord, pour que je puisse me faire comprendre. Donc, je ne voudrais pas qu'on mélange les deux. Parce que si on mélange les deux pour dire que c'est des questions de minorité, ça là, certains acteurs politiques ne seront pas d'accord. Ils vont je ne veux pas utiliser des mots, d'accord? Donc, ça là, je ne voudrais pas qu'on fasse ça. En revanche, pour ce qui concerne la personne de sexe féminin, surtout les filles, moi, je vous ai écouté, mais je voudrais qu'on travaille dans le lobbying pour que la fille qui est arrivée à l'université puisse disposer, quelle que soit la moyenne, puisse disposer d'un soutien financier. Parce que quand elle n'a pas de soutien financier et que les parents ne disposent pas, excusez-moi l'expression, elle devient un objet sexuel d'un homme à l'université et c'est cet homme qui vient imposer le rythme sexuel. Or, ce qu'on ne voulait pas depuis d'elle au secondaire, c'est ça que nous risquons d'avoir à l'université. C'est-à-dire quoi? Les grossesses qui vont être encore des sous-sortes de non-maintien des filles à l'université. Voilà, je ne vois pas qu'on mette les deux sur ce point. Je reviens également sur la question de la structure de l'économie mondiale. Non, notre problème d'une faible représentativité de la personne de sexe féminin dans ce domaine n'est pas lié à la nature de la structure, mais plutôt lié à la capacité, à la compétition, aux compétences des personnes de sexe féminin qui ne sont pas toujours compétentes sur le marché de l'emploi. Est-ce que vous voyez, quand vous prenez certains secteurs, nous avons encore de problèmes pour disposer de la présence des filles. Donc, n'allons pas prendre comme mobile, d'accord, la structure de l'économie mondiale qui justifie ce que j'appelle la faible représentativité de la personne de sexe féminin. Si nous prenons ça comme approche, on ne va pas gagner. Mais en revanche, il faut travailler une fois que les diplômes obtenus, que les femmes, les filles, elles puissent s'adapter. J'ai écouté l'autre qui l'a dit, à leur capacité à prendre la parole pour aborder certains sujets de la société. Et ça aussi, nous en avons besoin, d'accord? Moi, je vous ai dit, je pense que j'aurai l'occasion de rencontrer quelques-unes parmi vous dans nos prochaines séances, d'accord? Donc, voilà ce que je voudrais dire pour ne pas monopoliser la parole. Bon, je viens un peu pour avoir travaillé sur sa femme et politique au Bénin. Nous, depuis 2019, nous avons pu modifier la législation, ce qui a permis d'avoir pour la première fois plus de 10 femmes élues députées depuis 1995. D'accord? Donc, depuis 2019, la législation qui est là aujourd'hui, d'accord, nous avons 24 femmes, au moins 24 femmes au Bénin, qui sont des élus, ce qui n'est jamais arrivé. Donc, on aura des lois que j'appelle la discrimination positive, d'accord, pour les amener. Oui, mais pour qu'elles ne prennent pas ça comme un gain, pour ne pas travailler. D'accord? Je tiens à vous remercier et je remercie les traducteurs également. Merci.
Thank you so much, especially for giving us that success story about women representation in Benin. We have a question from Damilula, and I think Martha or Felista, one of you can take this, and I'll read out the question. She says, please, what can we do when you have young girls with the skills, even better qualified for positions, and they are pushed back or denied opportunities just because they are girls? Because you mentioned capacity and skills, and I have personal experiences in the last few months where it is women and men alike denying these young girls with same qualification position just because they are girls. This is in relation to girls in engineering, and this cuts across other sectors. Thank you. So Martha or Felista, one of you can try and give an answer to Damilula. Damilula, thank you so much for sharing your question.
No, thank you so much for that question. Indeed, I think the question from Daniela speaks to the reality that most young women confront. and there's not one single solution, but maybe multiple approaches towards addressing this conundrum. One would be really to utilize the power of social networking, being in spaces where, for example, women in STEM, participating maybe on a volunteer basis for a little bit until such a time that their entry points and opportunities, but also really continuing to knock on doors, having mentors. I think it also helps to have like a mentee-mentor relationship. Because some of us have gotten to where we are as a result of someone opening doors for you. So I really understand the situation that sometimes, one's identity as a young woman can actually act against them getting into spaces. But one way to look at it is to look at it from an ecosystem perspective, to look at how others can actually be your foundational building ground for you to enter into such spaces. And also to not give up, not give up, be willing to share your expertise, even on a pro bono basis, until such a time that opportunities arise. I think that's for me some of the recommendations that I could give you on this particular conundrum.
I liked the points you made about women who've made it, also opening doors for other women to also, walk through or also enjoy that level of success. I think it's very important. I think we're at this point, we'll be wrapping up. So maybe Felista, you would give us your final remarks, which would perhaps lean towards answering this question, which is that why does gender-based violence persist despite legal protections? I think that's one fundamental question that I keep asking myself. And is it the fact that we're failing at enforcement or accountability, or both, perhaps? So maybe you can shed some light on that.
Yes, we are failing on both in terms of implementation, but also accountability by governments. Because when it comes to protection and prevention, I think a lot of our governments have been signatory to some of the, legal and policy framework, including CEDAW, the Maputo Protocol, which really places that burden to them on them in terms of being able to protect, but also prevent violence against women. But also, I think aside from that, it's important to know to look at the fact that we have even new emerging forms of violence that maybe have not been anticipated in the laws that existed previously. I know with the new convention on violence against women, they have tried to incorporate some of these forms of violation, including femicide and technological facilitated violence. But also to understand, sometimes when we talk about social norms as contributing factors to violence against women, is to understand what description we have of social norms has actually changed. Because a lot of times when we talk about social and gender norms, we talk about the tradition. So we meet with the elders, we meet with the religious leaders. However, there's a whole online movement around this pro-masculinity conversations, as well as these trad wives conversations that are actually proceeding to shape the conversations and also fueling violence against women and girls. And I think one of the studies that have been done, one in the UK, shows that boys continuing to listen to these manosphere conversations that are really anchored around hating on women and reclaiming masculinity through violence, have actually had direct consequence about how they treat their girls they're in school with. And even in a recent case in the UK where the man murdered his girlfriend, the sister of the girlfriend and the mother, he had actually watched some of those Andrew Tate videos before, and then he went and murdered these 3 women. So there is a very direct correlation between these social conversations that are happening online in relation to how we are seeing violence manifest within our continent. For example, the violation around femicide, it's not something that was very prevalent, but now it has become very prevalent, and people denying that women are being killed purely for being women, because that is what we are seeing. It's just a misogynistic act of violence. I just don't like you as a woman, or I think you are lesser than me. And I remember even in the South African space, there was one of those manosphere gentlemen speaking about one of the influencers, Milhali, and describing her like an animal. He said she's like an animal. You can just gut her, kill her, you can do anything with her. That conversation is part of this formulation we have around gender and social norms. So we have to rethink how also we are changing our activism with the current context. But if you will allow me, Mame, I wanted to respond to the gentleman. One of the things he said is around skill, which I found it actually an oxymoron, because on the other side, we have somebody else say that women have skills, but then they're being removed from positions of decision making. And then this gentleman thinks that, women do not have enough skills, or they're asking for these spaces from a place of not having enough skills. And I think that is a persistent stereotype that I've seen a lot in the conversation, where we actually say, despite women having skills, still when it comes to being picked for something, it's for some reason women do not end up being picked. And of course, largely this reason being our patriarchal misogynistic perception of either the capacity of women or even the right for them to be able to hold those spaces and to engage in that sense of power. And then also when we talk about if we do activism like this, then we will not win. I really would like to remind all of us that we are not working in a systematic, perfect world where we get to play by the rules, and especially in the current environment. Whatever strategies will work, even guerrilla kind of activism, please take it there, because currently the kind of environment we are working in is not the same. So the idea that if we go a certain way, we will not be able to get results is not it. And we need to be bold in terms of how we fight back. Yeah.
We definitely need to be bold. Thank you so much on that note. I think that our time is fast spent, but I'm going to allow our speakers to give us one sentence to take away. And I'd like to start with Amina. Amina, if you're still on the call, what is that one sentence you'd want us to walk away from today's discussion? Amina, are you here? No? Okay. Shannon? What is that one thing you'd want us to walk away with?
Implementation. Just one word. Like
implementation?
Cool. Yeah, it's cool to have this conversation, It's cool to put this out there, but then are we affecting the people on the ground? And I think it's like to move it from that space and implementation. I feel like in all aspects of everything that we've spoken about today, that's what it comes down to.
Awesome. Thanks. Martha?
for me is just for us to recognize that when we're talking about women's rights, women's realization of economic rights or political rights, it's not necessarily a moral issue. We need to look at it from a political lens. But I think we also need to make the argument that it's also an economic issue. We need to link, women's economic empowerment, women's political empowerment. How does it make economic sense? Smart economics to promote women's economic empowerment and to promote women's political participation. It makes countries develop.
Thank you. Diana?
I think me will just be to expand a bit of what Charlotte said. We say that we are all agents of change. So to have implementation, we need to understand what is our role in implementing, and we shouldn't just rely on the government and so on. Often we are waiting on the government to do so, on the African Union to do so, and so on. But then not necessarily understanding that we all individually have a responsibility, to kind of push the agenda forward for gender equality. So I just wanted to put it out there. Thank you very much.
Great. And Amina, what is that one thing you want us to walk away with from this webinar?
Thank you so much. Apologies, I was struggling to put on my struggling to unmute and put on my screen. Yes, so the women's issues is not about women, it's about development. It's about our collective progress. And what I would like to see is accelerated action. So I want us to act. I think we've, the research is there, the data is there, the policies, the laws, a lot of the laws and the policies are already there. What we lack is political will. What we lack is execution and implementation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all, our dear speakers, for joining us today to have this startling but important conversation. And I think that as we continue to have these conversations, let us remember that gender equality is a collective responsibility. We encourage you to take action every day. We encourage you to engage in advocacy, and we encourage you to support initiatives that actually drive meaningful change. Remember that it all starts with you. And also to encourage you to stay connected with Barometer, with Oxfam in Africa, with IDRC and APIM for more discussions and data-driven insights. So thank you to our wonderful audience, our wonderful participants for staying with us from the beginning to end. And I wish you all a great day. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.